It is certainly possible that the ship was blown up by a mine. The Maine was sunk by an act of dirty treachery on the part of the Spaniards.
Theodore Roosevelt knew that Cuba and other Spanish possessions in the Caribbean blocked total American hegemony of the area. To get Spain out of the Western Hemisphere would naturally take a war. And Theodore Roosevelt was all for a war to advance American international interests.
Assistant Secretary Roosevelt pushed President McKinley to take a bolder stance against Spain. The president, awaiting the court's report, stood firm in withholding his judgment. His patience was lambasted in the yellow press. William Randolph Hearst, editorializing in the New York Journal, condemned McKinley, claiming he was ready to surrender every particle of national honor and dignity. The president could rise above such blatant attacks. What he could not ignore, however, were the initial findings trickling from the inquiry. It seemed increasingly likely that a mine had destroyed the Maine. A mine meant sabotage, and sabotage meant war. McKinley was in a precarious position. He needed to remain neutral until the investigation's report was released, while still ensuring that the nation was ready to fight. Compelled by the Jingo factions in Congress, he requested passage of a military appropriations bill totaling $50 million, an astronomical sum at the time.
So the fact that the president asked for $50 million and the fact that Congress approved that appropriation in record time meant that there was a feeling in Congress, a very conservative Congress, that war with Spain was in fact inevitable.
Into this bellicose atmosphere, the Court of Inquiry released its long-awaited final report on March 28th. In its conclusion, the court asserted that the loss of the Maine was caused neither by accident nor negligence on the part of her officers or crew, but by the intentional explosion of a mine. Members of the panel were careful to note, however, that there was no visible evidence as to who might have planted it.
The conclusion benefited everyone except the Spanish. Got Captain Sigsbee and his senior officers off the hook quite well. It was a good answer for the U.S. Navy. Our ships are safe, and we don't design bad ones, and they don't blow up by accident. Our stuff is good.
The American public's reaction to the court's report was expressed in a slogan that echoed across the nation. To hell with Spain, remember the Maine. Enraged patriots ignored the fact that the court did not fix blame for the explosion of the ship. To the man in the street, there was only one culprit: Spain. The din of so many Americans clamoring for war entirely drowned out the news that a Spanish court of inquiry had come to some different conclusions about the disaster. This court asserted that the Maine explosion couldn't possibly have been caused by a mine, based on the fact that not one eyewitness had reported any one of the phenomena usually accompanying mine blasts, such as a tower of water or masses of dead fish lying alongside the ship. The Spanish investigators even went a step further. They sent a team of divers to search for the physical evidence that a mine would have left behind.
That was quite a reasonable thing to do, and it's surprising that the Americans never bothered looking for either remnants of a mine casing, or wires that would have to have been hundreds of yards long leading to shore emplacements with gizmos there to ignite the mine. The Spanish went looking for that and found none.
Though persuasive, the Spaniards' arguments were diluted by the limited scope of their investigation. They did not have access to the wreck, nor did they question any of the Maine's survivors. Consequently, their report was dismissed as politically motivated, or, in the words of Captain Sigsbee, a fish story. In Washington, Roosevelt and other Capitol Hill Jingos increased their pressure on President McKinley to declare war on Spain. McKinley still resisted. Without knowing who had planted the mine, he reasoned there was no one against whom to declare war. But the taciturn president was clearly in turmoil. As political urgency for aggression mounted, McKinley's personal aversion to war became evident.
President McKinley had served during the Civil War and saw tremendous carnage in the battlefield as a young officer. He certainly did not want to send American boys to that type of fate again. He was very cognizant of his responsibility to try to promote peace.
Pressured by a nation hungry for war, yet torn by the force of his personal convictions, President McKinley continued to seek a diplomatic solution to the crisis. In a last desperate move toward compromise, the president succeeded in convincing Spain to agree to a ceasefire with the Cuban rebels, but failed to persuade her to set the island of Cuba free. Under incessant pressure from the Jingo faction and Congress, McKinley finally gave in and delivered an ultimatum. Spain must grant Cuba independence or face prompt military intervention by the United States. Spain responded by ordering the American ambassador out of Madrid. On April 25, 1898, the inevitable became reality. The United States declared war on Spain, a war triggered by the explosion of the USS Maine. Sea Tales will return in a moment. Rallying cry, "Remember the Maine," thousands of Americans marched off to fight the Spaniards. The 3-month-long war made thrilling copy for the headline insatiable yellow press. On land, the conflict climaxed when Teddy Roosevelt, who had resigned his post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, led the Rough Riders in a dashing charge up San Juan Hill, assuring Cuban independence. At sea, Commodore George Dewey's Asiatic Squadron annihilated the Spanish fleet in the Philippines, fulfilling the promise of a world-class Navy born with the Maine. So swift and complete was the American victory that not even William Randolph Hearst could have conjured it up in his most sensational headline. In the words of Secretary of State John Hay, the Spanish-American conflict was a splendid little war.
To a degree, it certainly was. It lasted 3 months. American casualties were in the whole under 300 people. We acquired an empire virtually by default from Spain, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, Guantanamo Bay. We acquired hemispheric hegemony over North America, and the United States now took its place as one of the great powers in the world, a nation to be reckoned with.
But long after the last cheer for America's homecoming heroes echoed away, the ship that incited the war still lay, a twisted, rusted wreck in the center of Havana Harbor. It was not until 1908, the 10th anniversary of the conflict, that public sentiment emerged to raise her.
One of the reasons the Maine had to be raised from Havana Harbor was that it was becoming an obstruction to commerce and other activities. And there was also a desire, a very strong desire, to find the rest of the bodies that had not floated up to the surface.
In 1911, over 60 crewmen of the Maine remained entombed in her disfigured hull, and in reverence to their memories, work to salvage her began. The Army Corps of Engineers supervised construction of a coffer dam surrounding the wreck, allowing the enclosed water to be pumped out. The entire project took nearly a year. With the wreckage completely exposed, a second court of inquiry arrived in Havana to begin its inspection. After much study, it came to the same conclusion as had the original court. A mine had destroyed the Maine.
They determined this by a complete photographic record of the wreck, and they found some indented plates on the port side a bit further aft of the bent keel. And from this, they deduced that a mine indeed had set off the powder magazines.
In February 1912, after the Court of Inquiry finished its investigation, the wrecking crew began the task of preparing the ship for burial at sea. They removed the twisted masts of the bow and affixed a bulkhead to the after section. Pumps poured water back into the cofferdam, and the Maine, or what was left of it, was floating in Havana Harbor for the first time since the explosion. At sunrise on the morning of March 16th, 1912, the citizens of Havana awoke to a cannon shot. The first formal burial at sea of an American naval vessel. The last rites of the USS Maine had begun. Simulating the tolling of a bell, a gunshot rang out every half hour. The ceremony commenced with a memorial service in Havana for the 67 men whose remains had been recovered from the wreck. Afterwards, sailors placed their coffins on the battleship North Carolina for transport to Arlington National Cemetery and burial alongside their comrades. With 2 more cannon blasts, the final voyage of the Maine began. The Maine had been especially prepared for this day. Roses covered her decks, and an American flag waved from her mast. She would not sink without her nation's colors. On shore, 80,000 Cubans watched the procession. Men removed their hats as the once proud ship left their harbor for the last time. 4 miles out from Havana in international waters, the Army engineers briefly boarded the Maine to open the ship's valves. As water rushed in and the Maine began to sink, the Marine band on the North Carolina played the national anthem. Johnny O'Brien, the tugboat captain, spoke for many that day.
In no way could she have met a sweeter or more peaceful end. The sea beckoned her, and she went swiftly and gladly to its bosom.
At 5:30 p.m., the USS Maine was gone. The roses from her deck floated above the burial site. The Maine would not rest in peace. Ever since the blast, haunting questions lingered, leaving many historians and naval experts harboring serious doubts about the official explanation of the explosion.
It is quite self-evident. You would not have a mine where ships are crowded in a mooring area. It does not protect the harbor whatsoever. That would have been at the harbor entrance, not in the middle of the roadstead where ships are anchoring. It's just a no-brainer to think otherwise.
And in all the years since the Maine has blown up, no one ever did and no one has come forward to say that they knew anybody, heard anything, or came up with any reason why that was ever done. Well, the reason nobody said anything was it didn't happen.
In 1974, Admiral Hyman Rickover and naval experts initiated yet another investigation to determine once and for all how the Maine exploded. Applying data gathered from World War II battleship explosions to the detailed photographic record compiled by the Second Court of Inquiry, the Rickover team found a much different cause for the Maine disaster than those of the two previous investigations. Dana Wegner was a member of the Rickover team.
The team could not rule out the possibility of spontaneous combustion of coal that caused the magazine to explode. And there was no evidence of anything on the outside of the ship instigating the explosion of the forward magazines of the Maine. Therefore, the explosion was solely within the confines of the ship and had to be an accidental explosion.
Could an accident have triggered a war? Perhaps that was a truth Americans did not want to face in 1898. The only questions the original court asked about the possibility of spontaneous combustion of coal in the bunkers concerned whether the standard inspections at the time had been followed. Ship personnel testified that they had and that the bunkers were found safe.
All of that was inadequate to overcome what basically was a design flaw in the ship, that they had put the bunker right up against the magazine.
No longer a battle cry, Remember the Maine has become an elegy. To memorialize her, more than 400 communities and institutions throughout the United States besieged the federal government for salvaged parts of the vessel. What would have been sold as scrap was given away as cherished keepsakes of history.
I think the Maine should be remembered because it was a tragedy. And in my mind, I feel sorry for all the enlisted men that died. It was too bad that they all died in an accident like that.
Who were these young men? In a sense, they were America itself. Not only were they from New England and New York, but they were from Norway, Russia, Japan. And isn't that what America of the 1890s was all about? The Maine truly was the symbol of America at its most glorious period. It has become part of our tradition, part of the myth of America, and certainly part of the American legacy.
Years after the disaster, Admiral Sigsbee reflected on his lost command. I shall always remember the Maine with as much pride as any commander could possibly feel. The men who were lost with the Maine were as worthy and true patriots as those we have lost in battle. Their fate was a sadder one. As the Maine lies barnacled beneath the waters, she is no longer a brash symbol of naval might, but a wise reminder from history. When warring nations clash, the sea defends no cause. She simply serves as the stage on which conflict can be resolved until peace can reign once more.
Now you can own a video cassette of this program. Call 1-800-423-1212 and you'll receive the program you've just seen for only $19.95 plus shipping and handling. Call 1-800-423-1212.